Thanks everyone for resisting until the last presentation of the morning. It was a bit of a full immersion into many aspects of theoretical and practical winemaking. I'm pretty glad to see that most of the people are still there. They didn't run away, so it means that the content was not too bad. Okay, so in this last presentation, we will deal with an aspect that has been coming at different points in some of the previous presentation, and is the aspects that relates to wine aroma and the way that can be influenced by oxygen and by closure. It is true that most of the times when we participate to a tasting where we have the opportunity to evaluate the effect of different closures or different levels of oxygen, as we heard, for example, in the presentation of Hannibal about microoxygenation, one of the things where we look for more differences, and very often we see at that level the most evident difference is the level of aroma. So we put the nose in the wine, in the glass, and we seem to be able to see big variations in the aroma characteristics of the wine. An opportunity for this will come after this presentation, because there will be a little tasting of wines that have been closed with different closures allowing different amounts of oxygen. So hopefully you see some of the differences that I'm going to talk about. For sure, aroma characteristics is one of the aspects that is most influenced by oxygen. So when you think about playing with oxygen and with closure, imagine that one of the things that you're going to influence the most in your wine is the aroma composition, the aroma characteristics. Okay. Wow, that's strong. That's why I was avoiding it. Okay, so practically speaking, there's also, it's not just for the interest in, sniffing a wine and seeing what aromas it has, but also from a consumer perspective. One of the things that consumers are most responsive to, one of the things that consumers talks most about, is the aroma characteristics of the wine. And there's a lot of studies showing that based on aroma preference, consumers will go back and buy a bottle of wine that they liked. So it's one of the parameters that consumers use to assess the preference of a wine. Even if a consumer doesn't necessarily know to describe the aroma of a wine, he will keep that in mind, he will retain that characteristic as some aspects that he really liked, and will go back and buy that wine again and again. So for many reasons, people talk about styles of wines and sensory characteristics of the wine from the point of view of some trends that we see in the industry today. For example, if we take a red wine and we look at different aroma characteristics that we can observe in a wine, so wine that are a bit reduced, we'll go back to talk about this because this is really the topic of this presentation, wine that are not very expressive, or wine that starts to express intense fruity aromas. We heard about that in the first presentation this morning, as well as some spicy or chocolate aromas. These seem to be some characters that are discriminating today between good and less preferred wines. And same for white wines, we see some ripe fruit aromas, dry fruit, or some grapefruit or tropical aromas being preferred by most consumers. In some cases, or in some regions, we talk about some smoky aromas as being part of the terroir or some characteristics. So these aromas are also something that some consumers are looking for. Of course, more and more, again, consumers and critics are becoming very negative about what they call reductive aromas, and we will go back to these again and talk about it. And of course, as you would expect, because that's what we're talking about today, there's a possibility to shift the aroma profile of a wine from a more reduced profile to a more expressive and fruity aromas by playing with oxygen. Typically, wines that are exposed to less oxygen are characterized, or have a higher risk to express these reductive aromas that some consumers might not like. Whereas if we go for more oxygen, we have higher chances to create wines with an aroma profile that is more fruity, sometimes more spicy, depending on the wine, more ripe fruit. But of course, it's not always so easy, because if we go too far in this, we don't want to expose the wines to too much oxygen, because then the wine will be oxidized. And oxidation, aroma oxidation, is typically not reversible. Once the wine is oxidized, then it's finished. So there's a balance that we need to attain. And although I know that most of you don't like too much a lot of chemistry, very often in aroma analysis, in studies about aroma compounds, we tend to identify the aroma molecules that are responsible for the expression of these different attributes, so that we can then, practically speaking, manage those aroma characteristics and try to make actions in the winery to limit the presence if they're negative aromas or optimize the concentrations if they're positive aromas. Okay? Now, if we look at this diagram again and go back to the concept of industry trends, these are the regions where we want to be with our wines today. You know, we want to express wines that have fruity aromas, that have maybe some spicy or chocolate aromas in some cases. Turns out, and we want to avoid the reductive aromas. It turns out that from a chemistry point of view, the family of molecules that are really involved with these are molecules that we call thiols. And we'll go to more detail on this in a minute, but these are molecules that contain some sulfur in it, and they're part of the family of sulfur compounds, which also contribute to the aroma of a lot of other food that we consume every day. So certainly for the fruity aromas in a white wine, for the smoky aromas, and for the reductive aromas in red and whites, we know that thiols are very important. Probably they are important to some red fruit aromas in red wines too, so again, attributes that we really want to have in a wine. So certainly these are molecules that we have to deal with. Although, as I said, very often we tend to stay away from the complex aroma chemistry stuff that is obviously a little bit complicated to deal with. But just to make it simple and still have a level of understanding of what happens when we have to deal with these aroma compounds. I think, well, in Italy, I'm from Italy originally, and we're very big fans of spaghetti westerns, okay? So I do believe that here in South America, you have a little bit of this. Okay, something has disappeared here. Ah, okay, so I had to go the other way around, sorry. I think here in South America, these guys are pretty famous too, right? Most of you would have seen some movies where these guys are in there. They contribute to the stories. One is good, another one is bad, and another one is ugly, okay? Now, the thing with these sulfur compounds is very much similar. There's a very good analogy in that sense, because although they all have this sulfur in them, as I said, they're all thiols, and here you see some examples of that. Some of them are contributing to nice fruity aromas. Some of them are contributing to nice, complex, smoky, mineral aromas in some cases. So these will be the good. These will be maybe there's some, mysterious a little bit, but still pretty good. But then you have the bad and the ugly, because some out of these sulfur compounds, they bring in the picture aromas that we don't want. We typically try to avoid in winemaking. Rotten cabbage, rotten eggs, and these are the typical reductive aromas. So these are aromas that exist in wine. They're mainly supported by these sulfur compounds, methyl mercaptans or mercaptans more in general, and H2S, which is another very low molecular weight sulfur compound, reminding the aroma of a rotten egg. So something we don't want in a wine, but we do smell these compounds quite often. They contribute to the aroma of a wine. What we don't want is that to have them at very high concentrations where they dominate the aroma of wine. On the other end of the spectrum, we will try to have more, as much as possible, of these aroma compounds, because they contribute to the nice aromas, the nice attributes that we want to have in order for our wine to be in the consumer preference, as we said before. Okay, so practically speaking, what happens is that because all these compounds contain a sulfur molecule, and in fact, a sulfur atom, and in fact, to be a thiol, they have to have a sulfur linked to a nitrogen, so what we call an SH, a thiol group. This is, in fact, a thiol group. They all have this, and they all have similar behaviors in the wine environment, because it's this SH part of the molecule that will make them reactive against when the oxygen is present. So there's been at some point in the history of recent wine science, wine chemistry, and so also of recent innovations in winemaking habits that exist around the world. There's been an observation that certain styles of wines are very rich in these good sulfur compounds. For example, mercaptohexanol and mercaptohexyl acetate. These are two of the good ones, the good smelling ones. For example, you're all familiar with the aroma of Sauvignon Blanc, particularly the ones from New Zealand, but from many parts of the world, they have these very nice, fresh, tropical fruit aromas, okay? This is very much driven by the presence of these compounds. So just keep that in mind as a reference. But more and more in many countries around the world, there's been evidence that a lot of the local varieties, for Verdejo, for example, in the north of Spain or in Portugal, Manseng in the south of France, Verdicchio in Italy, and some Rieslings, they really depend, their aroma is really characterized by the presence of these compounds. So to have those aroma characters of grapefruit, or tropical fruit, passion fruit, you really need to preserve these compounds. But the problem, practically speaking, is that these compounds are very fragile. So typically, these fruity aromas in these wines, they tend to disappear with time. When the wine is gone in a bottle, we start very intense, the wine is very fresh, it's very fruity, and then over time, in the bottle, and sometimes very quickly, as a matter of a couple of months, these aromas are disappearing quite strongly. And so we end up with a wine at the moment that we bottled, it was nice and fruity and fresh, but by the time it reaches the consumer, it's pretty flat. It doesn't retain a lot of these very attractive aroma attributes. And so from a consumer perspective, it's a wine that maybe a consumer will buy, will taste, will not find very interesting, will not go back and buy next time. So that's a little bit physiological, if you want. It's just the instability of certain molecule in the wine environment, particularly because wine is acidic, so it's a very dynamic environment where there's a lot of reaction taking place, but also because there's always going to be, as you heard before, a little bit of oxygen that we have during the bottling process. It's present in the wine when it's stored in the tank, and it will come through the closure. So we can't do much about the fact that the wine is acidic. It's just one of the characteristics of the wine. But of course, we can protect the wine from oxygen. And in fact, what we have, and that's one of the trends that we see more and more in the wine industry today, to preserve these aromas, is to limit the exposure of wine to oxygen. So we heard before, we can bottle with lower oxygen levels. We can also choose a closure that allows very little oxygen in the winery, in the bottle, so that we go from this situation where these aromas are lost very rapidly to a situation where these aromas are still going to be lost because, as I said, there's a certain reactions that will take place, but to a much less, to a much slower extent. So that increases the chances that when the wine will reach the consumer, it will be in good shape and will still exhibit those nice aromas. By the way, having less oxygen will also preserve or even favor the formation of some of these complex mineral, smoky aromas that in some regions are very sought after by consumers. Imagine there are some wines in the Loire Valley in France that are called Fumé Blanc. These are made of Sauvignon Blanc, and they're very much characterized by these smoky, fumé, that's in French is smoky, aromas. So in that region, producers are really looking to have the expression of these aromas in their wines. So again, one way to favor the formation of these compounds is to preserve the wines from too much oxygen. But the problem, and it's just in the name already, the opposite of oxidation, which too much oxygen will be reduction. The problem is that when we preserve the wine from oxygen too much, so we really keep it in a very oxygen protective environment, also the formation of these reductive bad aroma compounds, so these bad guys, will be promoted. And so what happens often is that the wine goes in the bottle, clean, with nice fruity aromas. We want to preserve those fruity aromas, we protect it from oxygen, but during time in the bottle, we also observe the formation of very high levels of these reductive aromas. And so after a certain period of time, the wine maybe has not lost those fruity aromas, but we cannot smell them anyway because the aroma of the wine is dominated by the presence of these not pleasant, unpleasant, reductive aroma compounds. So it's a matter of a balance. Eventually, as a winemaker, what you will be trying to reach for the style of wine that you want to create is a good balance between the preservation of these aromas, the mineral ones if you want, but certainly the fruity ones because that tend to be quite generally good for the aroma profile of white wines, and limit at the same time the formation of the bad ones. The problem, practically speaking, as you might imagine, is that just again in the spaghetti western analogy, most people tend to like this character in the spaghetti western analogy, but this character would not be very interesting without the other two. So in the story, they all link together. You know, there's no way you can make the story interesting if you don't have the bad guys. The reality is that in the wine evolution inside a bottle, there is a good relationship between the way the good guys, the good aromas are preserved, the good thiols are preserved, and the way the bad thiols will increase. So typically you see a reasonably good correlation between these two families of molecules. And that's because, again, they both sulfur compound, they both have this SH part in their molecule, so they tend to do similar things. So every time you're trying to preserve the good ones, for example, by protecting the wines from oxygen, the chances for you to have a wine that turns towards a reductive aromas, and so overall is not that pleasant, aromatically speaking, will increase. So every time to keep the guys in the story, you will have also these guys appearing at some point in the story. Another analogy that somebody pointed out to me recently is like there's always in a family a cousin that nobody likes. But this guy always showed up to all the dinners and the family parties, okay? There's no way you can keep him away. You don't invite him, but for some reason he knows about this party and he will come there and will spoil the party. So it's a little bit like that. There's a close relationship. Even worse, to make things more complicated, there are some wines, we call them here outliers. So some wines that really have a tendency to go for these reductive aromas. So as soon as you protect them from oxygen, they really quickly build up these reductive aromas and they really express these negative aromas. And so these are really the ones that you need to be particularly careful about. Problem is they're not very easy to identify, but we'll probably have some elements. Again, we don't have a mechanistic explanation for it, but we have some elements to identify them a little bit or to predict the fact that maybe these ones are going to turn reductive. Okay, again, sorry, but we need to go back to chemistry sometime. Okay, what happens in a wine when it's exposed to oxygen is that the first target for this oxidation of the wine is actually phenolic compounds. So these are phenolic compounds present in the grape. They will form an oxidized, very reactive species that we call quinones. And these quinones will be the driver of the Fenton reaction leading to formation of acetaldehyde from ethanol, but also with a lot of other reactions. Some of these reactions are interesting. For example, you see, by forming quinones, we catalyze the certain reactions involving tannins. They might, in combination with the reactions of acetaldehyde, might influence positively the bitterness and the astringency. I'm not talking about color, but you heard this morning already that there's a lot of reactions supporting color stability when there's a bit of oxidation going on. Of course, they do also some negative things. They create some of these aldehydes that are responsible for oxidized aromas in the wine by reacting with amino acids. But they will react with thiols, so with the volatile sulfur compounds. Now, when they react with the volatile sulfur compounds, there are two things happening. If the wine has a tendency to go for reduction, they will remove those reductive photos. So that's a good thing. So that's one way to identify wines where oxygen can be beneficial, is the wines that have a tendency to reduction and have an ability to form these quinones to remove these reductive aromas. At the same time, the same quinones will also react with the good thiols and will remove those varietal fruity aromas. So again, this same reaction can bring negative or positive consequences. We typically manage this process in wine making in a winery by adding SO2, the most effective antioxidant, and by the way, antimicrobial, so the most effective additive because of its antimicrobial and antioxidant properties in the wineries. So this will block everything, and it will preserve the varietal thiols, but also will also increase the risk that we build up those reductive aromas because we don't have the possibility of removing them by oxidation. There's another antioxidant that starts being added today. You can add glutathione. GSH is glutathione. You cannot add him directly pure, but there are additives that you can add will contain heavy doses of glutathione. So he's a thiol as well. As you can see, he's got SH in his name. So everything that thiols will do, glutathione will do it as well. And because there's a lot more glutathione typically when you add it in a wine compared to these small volatile compounds, the first thing will happen is that all these reactions will not happen anymore because glutathione will make a screen to those reactions. So glutathione is good at preserving the loss of the good aromas, but it's also increasing the chances of increasing the reductive aromas in the wine. So again, it's something to be thinking about, and we'll go back to that in a minute, in terms of where to add glutathione or where to do things that will protect the glutathione. Because one important thing about glutathione, you can add it, as I said, by adding these products that are very rich in glutathione, but glutathione is also present naturally in the grape or in the wine coming from the yeast metabolism. So there are also things you can do to protect the natural content of glutathione. But when you do that, you'll be influencing this. So you'll be influencing positively the fruity aroma compounds, but you also favor the presence of the negative aroma compounds. Now, where is oxygen coming in this picture and why is it interesting? As I said already many times, these two groups of compounds, they tend to do similar things, but it's not that they do exactly the same thing. There is a margin for them to be selectively removed. And in fact, this margin is offered by oxygen, which luckily brings out a character of these compounds that makes them somehow different. You see, for example, here we have an example of one wine, the same wine, so that's a Sauvignon Blanc, after 6 months in bottle, with two types of closure. One closure is allowed 1.4 milligrams per liter of oxygen in 6 months, and in the other case we had 4. Okay? So you see very big difference with these 3 milligrams, nearly 2.6 milligrams of difference in oxygen. Very big difference on a bad aroma compounds, on hydrogen sulfide. So that's very responsive to oxidation. Not very much for the good aroma compound. Okay, we lose a little bit, but not a lot, compared to how much oxygen, hydrogen sulfide we can remove with that same level of oxygen. So the conclusion from this series of studies we did was that the small aroma compounds, which are typically responsible for the bad reductive smells, they are the most responsive to oxygen. So they can be removed initially when we expose the wine to oxygen without compromising too much the bad aroma compounds. So that's when oxygen becomes a very interesting element of modulation of these aroma compounds, because it allows a certain selectivity in the way these thiols are reacting and they are removed. So by exposing the wines to little doses of oxygen in a controlled way, the first thing we're going to remove are the reductive aromas, which is very interesting from a winemaking point of view, because these are the ones we want to get rid of. These are the bad cousins that we don't want to invite to the party. So one way for them not to know that we're having a family party is oxygen. Okay? So that's one way to play with them in an interesting way. We also mentioned the fact that there are some wines that are they have this tendency to go for reduction. Okay? So as soon as they're not having enough oxygen, they immediately show these reductive characters. I already anticipated that we don't really know today how to predict. We start having some ideas, but we don't know chemically where this is coming from. But we made some observation. There are certain wines that are made with what they call reductive winemaking. For example, aging on lees or addition of glutathione, as I said. Now, these are the wines that retain very well the fruity aromas. Chemically speaking, they retain very well the mercaptohexanol, for example. But these are also the ones that have a tendency to accumulate these bad aroma compounds. So very often, these ones are very rich in sulfur compounds, very rich in fruity sulfur compounds, but we don't smell them, because they're also accumulating a lot of these reductive aroma compounds, which are masking the fruity compounds. So these are the ones where you want to give more oxygen. For example, these are the ones where you want to choose a closure that allows more oxygen in the bottle, so that you prevent the formation of these compounds, the bad aroma compounds. For a lot of conventional winemakings, or for certain varieties that are not particularly rich in these fruity compounds, these are really the wines that will tend to lose those fruity aromas very easily. They're more fragile, or they don't have a big reservoir already at the beginning. At the same time, it turns out that they don't really have a tendency to form reduction. So these are the wines that you want to close with a closure that protects them from oxygen as much as possible, so that you don't lose rapidly the fruity aromas, because in these wines you don't have to worry too much about the reductive aromas. They're not coming out that often in these wines. Okay? So again, we don't really understand today where this formation is coming from, but we made this observation that certain winemaking practices, and I mean, it's in the name already, okay? These are reductive winemaking, so they will tend to make the wine more reductive, so they increase the chances that you have this problem. So again, you can then think about closure selection as a way to prevent these wines from going too reductive. Okay? So they still retain their fruity aromas, but give them maybe a little bit of extra oxygen during time to prevent them from going too much into reduction mode and developing these bad aromas. Okay, so some of you might be wondering, okay, why should we go with all this complexity of choosing a closure and oxygen and so on, when there is a very easy way to fix reduction, which is adding copper at bottling. Increasing the content of copper in the wine has been used for a long time, very anecdotally, so based just on some experience or some very early studies that were done in Germany a long, long time ago, to remove reduction, based on the chemically sound concept that copper will bind thiols, okay, will bind mercaptans. The name mercaptans, by the way, is because these compounds will capture mercury. Okay? So historically, they've been used to remove mercury, which belongs to the same family of copper for certain chemical properties. So along the same lines, mercury is very toxic. We don't use it today in the wine industry. We try to stay away from adding mercury to a wine. But copper is not so toxic. So we can imagine adding copper to remove the reductive aroma compounds. But also keep in mind one thing. Okay, so this is very anecdotal. Okay, so this has been done for a long time, but it's not really based on sound science. And in recent years, people have started to investigate this, based on the fact that a lot of winemakers, especially in countries where there's a lot of this practice of adding copper, like Australia, they were saying, look, we do add copper because we always done it. But if you really want to know whether it works, we don't know. We don't see it working very well. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. We don't understand it. So we did a series of studies. There's two things that emerged from these studies, which today there's a lot of studies confirming this. The first one is very simple. Remember, these are all thiols. They all have this SH, and the copper will bind to all of them, very non-selectively. So the first thing you observe, the mercaptohexanol, the good thiols, the good fruity aroma compounds, are going to be quickly removed. In this example here, when we added 0.3 milligrams, so we had a wine that initially had 0.2 milligrams per liter of total copper, very little, just very normal. We added a little bit, bring it to 0.5, that's still legal, there's no problem, there's no excess of copper in the wine, it's probably not driving any oxidation at all, but you see, we lost half of the mercaptohexanol just by doing this. Okay, so we're adding copper just in case the wine will form some reductive aromas, maybe later in its life. The first thing we do, we lose half of the good aroma compounds that we created by selecting good grapes, the good yeast, to do fermentation, protecting the wines and so on. Just by doing that, we lose half of that. So that's already, some might say, it's not a very good idea. The other very surprising evidence, which we did, we were probably the first one to observe in this study, which we did in Australia with the AWRI, but then many other studies have come along with the same type of observation, is that actually, over time, the presence of copper will increase the formation of these reductive aroma compounds. So if you do have some reductive aroma compounds at the beginning, copper will remove them, but will also remove the good aroma compounds, so you have to choose whether it's worth risking. But what it does in time, when you have more copper in the bottle, is actually increasing the chance of forming these aroma compounds in the bottle over time. Again, we made the observation, many people have made the observations as well. There is not enough understanding of why this happens, but it seems to happen in a lot of wines, in a lot of studies, in a lot of situations. So be very careful about this, call it traditional practice of adding copper, because it's very risky and it's got a lot of complicated implications that are very difficult to predict. So from our point of view, yes, maybe oxygen is a little bit more complicated to use, but it seems to be a little bit much safer compared to adding copper. Okay, again, just an example of how this variability exists also in red wines, in terms of wines that have a tendency to reduction, and some other wines that don't have a tendency to reduction. Here we have exposed a Shiraz wines over 24 months in bottle with 3 types of closures. So we have low levels of oxygen exposure in the bottle, a moderate, and we have a very low, a low and a moderate. So we go from a level that is similar to a screw cap to a level that is similar to most cylindrical closures. And you see there is one of the two wines, so wine number 1, when we go from low to from moderate to low to very low, when it gets some oxygen, it's really fruity, and then more and more it gets into the reductive aromas, which are associated with the presence, as we said, of the methyl mercaptan and hydrogen sulfide. There is wine number 2 that doesn't respond very much to oxygen. It's a bit fruity, it's a bit jammy, it's got more ripe aromas, or a little bit more chocolates, but the balance of this wine is very, very solidly, again, around these aroma attributes, and it doesn't go in reductive mode. So once again, this is not only considerations for white wine. We tend to think that white wines are more delicate, more fragile, more responsive to oxygen. But also in the case of red wines, we can introduce big variations in the aroma profile of the wine. And if we have a wine with a tendency to reduction, like wine number 1 here, we can really push it towards a more fruity aromas by playing with oxygen. Now, the big question, practically speaking, is how much oxygen is enough for a wine. And you already understand that every wine is different. But practically speaking, when we look at the development of a wine in the bottle and how much oxygen it will need, always keep in mind one thing. We'll be talking about very small amounts of oxygen that can make a big difference. Here, for example, it's an example of a Sauvignon Blanc. You see, over 12 months in the bottle, we are given to this wine either 0.6 milligram of oxygen over 1 year through the closure, or 1.2. So one is double than the other, so it's 100% difference, sure. But practically speaking, it's only 0.6 milligrams of difference over 1 year. And you see that the wine has gone from struck flint reductive aromas to nice tropical fruits. So that quantity over 1 year was enough for the wine to be smelling like reduction or like nice open ripe tropical fruit. So that's practically very small amounts of oxygen. So we need to be able to really use tools that allow us to control oxygen to that level of precision. Generally speaking, we tend to say that already 1-2 milligrams over a period of 6 months, 1 year can make already a lot of difference in a white wine. Red wines tend to be a bit more resistant, but already some wines we see that with a couple of milligrams over 1 year, that can really make a difference. So what does it mean, practically speaking? You've seen this diagram already in the presentation of Stefan. But just to bring more context around these values, you see that, okay, we said 2 elements are interesting here. One is the amount of oxygen that the closure is giving, okay? So it can be 2, as we said. It can be, these are values over 2 years, okay? So over 2 years, you can have some closures that allows 2, 2.5, 3. Some models will allow 4, 5. Some models will allow 10. Okay, so that depends on the wine. Certainly, certain closures like this or this are bringing a lot of oxygen in the bottle. So they will increase the chances for the wines to be oxidized. But in some cases, they can work very well if it was a wine that it needs a lot of oxygen. Okay? Some other closures, like Nomacork you see, are in this range, which we believe can make a lot of difference without going into the extremes of reduction of oxidation. But the other very important point is the variation that exists across a batch of the same closures. You see, Stefan has spoken about that before, big variations here, big variations here, small variations here. Now, when you think that 0.6 milligrams can make a difference for a Sauvignon Blanc wine to be either reductive or nice and fruity, if that difference in 0.6 milligrams exists across 2 closures of the same batch, it means that after 1 year, you will have 2 wines that are smelling completely different, but it's the same wine. So consumer might buy 1 bottle, the one that smells good, he like it, goes back, buy another one, doesn't like it anymore. He said, oh, I'm not going to buy this one again. You know, it's just, once it was good, but then I didn't like it anymore. It could be the opposite. You might not like it in the first place and never go back to it again. Okay? So this problem of how variable can be the oxygen ingress of a given closure in the same batch, in the same product, in the same batch, so the same bag, it's very important because the influence of oxygen on wine aroma is really happening across a very small range of values of oxygen exposure. So that can really make a lot of difference to the aroma of your wine, even those small variations in the oxygen ingress. Just to convince you again, I said at the beginning the thios are probably important to red wines for the fruity aromas, and we see that, yes, there are actually very high concentrations of some of these fruity sulfur compounds in Carmenere wines. And again, when you play with closure, here we have 3 examples of 3 closures allowing variable amount of oxygen. The tightest amount is the one with Select 300, so the red bar. It is really a way to preserve these aromas even in red wines, to have a closure that allows the adequate amount of oxygen. Of course, always have to keep in mind the reduction side of things. If you know that a wine has a tendency to reduction, be careful with the closures allowing little oxygen. But it's always a good way to preserve the fruity aromas in the wine. Okay, so just in conclusion, okay, the impact of oxygen on wine aroma is very strong. It can make a lot of difference. Hopefully you will taste it in the wines that are at the back of the room. And these differences are mainly driven, when we stay in levels of oxidation that are not extreme, these differences are mainly driven by the influence on volatile thiols. It could be reductive volatile thiols, the one we don't want, but sometimes they're there. It could be the nice fruity, the ones that we want, and sometimes they're not there enough. Okay? Closure is very powerful in this because it's a way to provide small doses of oxygen over time, so to provide very tiny amounts of oxygen, and therefore influence the aroma of the wine during time when it sits in the bottle. So also think about the fact that by choosing a closure, your ability to control the evolution of the wine is not finishing at the winemaking at the moment of bottling, but you'll be able to control what happens in the bottle as well. So your control as a winemaker about your product will extend over time. And I mean, there is this importance of providing closures with a very narrow and very reproducible levels of oxygen ingress, because otherwise the risk of bottle-to-bottle variation will increase a lot. Thank you for your attention.